Sometimes the life we choose is really just an echo of the secrets we never knew existed. At 62, Edda Romley thought she understood why she lived alone in the mountains, why she preferred silence to company, why solitude felt safer than trust. Then a rockslide uncovered a rusted hatch buried beneath rocks she'd walked past for years. Inside that hidden bunker, she found letters and recordings from a Cold War survivalist commune. But what stopped her cold was a name on those old documents, her own family name, connected to a woman who vanished decades ago. Her father never spoke of it. No one did. Now Edda had to ask herself a question that would change everything. What was buried so deep that someone built an entire bunker to hide it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Edda Romley found the hatch. She'd been living in the Granite Vale Range for exactly 10 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that she kept count on a calendar anymore. Time up here moved differently, marked by seasons instead of weeks, by the migration of elk herds and the first freeze of Shepherd's Creek rather than by holidays or birthdays. Her cabin sat at 7,800 feet, tucked into a natural alcove where 2 ridges met like cupped hands. She built most of it herself, with help from Ben Carlisle hauling in the materials she couldn't carry on foot. The structure was simple but solid. 16 by 20 feet of tongue-and-groove pine, a metal roof that shed snow without complaint, and a stone fireplace she'd mortared herself using river rock from the creek bed. One main room served as kitchen, living space, and workroom. A small bedroom barely fit her narrow bed, and a dresser her father had made 40 years ago. The loft above held her supplies, 50-pound bags of rice and beans, dried goods in sealed containers. Enough to last through 2 hard winters if she needed. She lived alone and preferred it. That way, it hadn't always been like this. Once, she'd had a husband, a house in Billings with neighbors whose names she knew, a job with the Montana Wildlife Service that required she attend meetings and file reports and make small talk in office break rooms. For 23 years, she tracked wolf packs and documented bear populations, spent weeks in the backcountry, but always returned to civilization. She'd been good at her work. Better than good, she had an instinct for reading animal behavior, for understanding how predators moved through territory, how they thought. The divorce came when she was 52. No drama, no betrayal. Just the slow realization that she and Dennis had become strangers who shared an address. He wanted retirement communities and golf courses in Arizona. She wanted silence and space to breathe. The papers were signed within 6 months. She took her half of the savings, sold everything that wouldn't fit in a pickup truck, and drove into the Granite Vale Range looking for a place where nobody would ask her how she was doing or suggest she join a book club. She found this spot in early autumn, when the aspens were gold against the dark pines. The moment she stood here, looking out at the endless ridges fading to blue in the distance, she knew she'd come home. Not the home she'd left behind, the real one she'd been searching for without knowing it. Her father would have understood. Vincent Romley had been a quiet man, comfortable with long silences, more at ease in the woods than anywhere else. He'd taught her to read topographical maps before she could ride a bicycle, showed her how to find north without a compass, how to move through timber without sound. He'd worked as a surveyor for the Forest Service, gone for weeks at a time mapping remote terrain. When he was home, he'd take her on long walks, pointing out animal tracks, teaching her the names of birds by their calls. He never explained why he preferred the wilderness to people. Never talked about his past or his family. When she asked as a child, he'd give brief answers that revealed nothing. His parents were dead. He had no siblings. He'd grown up in Idaho, moved to Montana for work. That was all she ever learned. The woman she'd known as her mother Vincent's wife, Anne, had died from an aneurysm when Edda was 8. After that, it was just her and her father, and he grew even quieter, retreating into his work and his maps. He died 5 years before she moved to the mountains. Heart attack, sudden and complete. She'd gone through his belongings and found nothing personal. No photographs, no letters, no journals. Just his surveying equipment, his maps, and a hand-carved walking stick he'd made from mountain ash. She'd brought the walking stick with her to the cabin. It leaned against the doorframe now, smooth from decades of use. The only thing she had that felt like an inheritance. She understood now that she'd learned isolation from him. Not loneliness, there was a difference. Loneliness was an ache, a wanting. Isolation was a choice, a deliberate distance that felt like safety. Her days had a rhythm she found comforting. Wake at first light. Start a fire in the stove if the morning was cold. Make coffee, real coffee, ground from beans she bought on her monthly supply runs. Oatmeal with dried fruit and a spoonful of honey. Then the morning rounds. Check the rain gauge, scan the ridges with binoculars for weather systems moving in. Make notes in her journal about animal activity. She still tracked wildlife, though nobody paid her for it anymore. Old habits. Afternoons she spent on maintenance, splitting wood, repairing tools, tending the small garden she'd terraced into the slope below the cabin. The growing season was short at this elevation, but she managed potatoes, carrots, hardy greens. Evenings were for reading. She had 24 books and traded them out when she went to town, always bringing back new ones from the library's donation shelf. She spoke to people maybe twice a month. Once during her supply run to Pinecrest, 40 minutes down a forest road that required 4-wheel drive and good nerves. She'd stop at Ben Carlisle's general store, stock up on coffee, flour, sugar, fuel. Ben was in his 60s, had run the store since his father died. He was one of those rare people who understood that not everyone needed conversation. He'd ask if she needed anything special, tell her the total, and wish her well. That was enough. The other contact was radio check-ins with the ranger station. She kept a 2-way radio for emergencies and weather updates. Twice a month, she'd call in to let them know she was alive. They appreciated having eyes up here. She'd report trail conditions, fire danger, any unusual animal behavior. They tried offering her seasonal work, but she'd declined. She wasn't ready to be on anyone's schedule but her own. Most people who knew about her thought she was running from something. That wasn't quite right. She wasn't running, she'd simply arrived where she belonged. There was peace in knowing exactly how far away the nearest human was. Peace in days that unfolded without surprise or demand. Peace in being accountable to nothing but the weather and her own survival. The rockslide happened on a Tuesday morning in late September. She'd walked this trail 1,000 times. It skirted the base of a granite outcropping about a quarter mile from her cabin. Following the ridge toward a seasonal spring she checked regularly. The nights had been cold. Probably frost wedging had finally loosened something that had been ready to give way for years. She heard it first, a crack like a rifle shot, then the rumble of stone on stone. She pressed herself against the cliff face as rocks bounced past, some the size of her fist, others large enough to break a leg. The slide lasted maybe 30 seconds. When the dust settled, she waited another 5 minutes before moving, making sure nothing else was coming down. The trail was blocked. Not badly, she could clear it in an afternoon. But the slide had exposed something in the rock face. A straight edge where straight edges didn't occur in nature. She moved closer, pulled away loose scree, and found herself looking at rusted metal. A hatch, maybe 3 feet square, set into the rock and covered with decades of mineral staining and debris. Her first thought was mining. The Granite Vale had seen some prospecting in the late 1800s, a few played-out silver claims. But this metal was wrong for that era too uniform, industrial. She brushed away more dirt and found hinges, heavy-duty, and a recessed handle. She should have left it alone. That was her instinct. Don't disturb what's hidden. Don't invite complication into a carefully ordered life. But something made her keep clearing debris. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the part of her that had been a wildlife tracker, trained to investigate anything unusual. It took an hour to clear enough to try the handle. She expected it to be locked or rusted shut, but it moved when she pulled. Not easily, she had to brace her feet and use her full weight, but it moved. The hatch opened with a groan of metal on metal. Darkness below. Stone steps leading down. The smell of stale air, cold and dry. She had a flashlight on her belt. She never walked these trails without one. The beam cut into the dark revealed concrete walls, more steps descending at least 20 feet. A bunker. Cold War era, she guessed. She'd heard stories about survivalist shelters built in the 60s, though she'd never seen one. This was remote enough that nobody would have found it by accident. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to build this and keep it hidden. She descended carefully, testing each step. The concrete was sound, no cracking or water damage. At the bottom, the flashlight revealed a corridor maybe 40 feet long, doors on both sides. The air was surprisingly dry, good ventilation. Probably passive vents somewhere in the rock above. The first room held shelving units with supplies. Canned goods, their labels faded but still readable. Dates from 1965, 1966. Medical supplies in dusty boxes. Blankets in sealed plastic. Everything covered in a fine layer of dust but remarkably preserved. The second room was living quarters. Bunk beds, 4 of them, made up with old blankets. A table and chairs. A shelf with books, paperbacks with cracked spines. Titles about self-sufficiency and wilderness survival. A kerosene lamp sat on the table, its glass chimney intact. The third room was what stopped her cold. A desk, a filing cabinet, and on the wall, a corkboard with papers still pinned to it. She moved closer, directing her flashlight at the documents. A roster of some kind, names and dates written in neat columns. At the top, printed in bold letters, Granite Vale Collective 1962. She scanned the names. 23 people, ages ranging from 19 to 54. Most had 2 dates listed, an arrival date and a departure date, but 5 names had only 1 date. No departure noted. Her light stopped on a name halfway down the list. Romley. Edda Romley, age 19. Arrived June 1906. 2. No departure date. Edda felt something shift in her chest, a sensation like the ground, dropping away beneath her feet. Romley wasn't a common name. In Montana, she'd met maybe 2 or 3 people who shared it, and they'd been distant relatives at best. She looked at the photograph stapled next to Isla's name. A young woman with dark hair, pulled back, serious eyes. A half smile that suggested she wasn't comfortable being photographed. The resemblance wasn't exact, but it was there. The same broad forehead, the same straight nose, the same way of holding her mouth. Edd took the roster down from the board, careful not to tear the aged paper. Her hands were steady. Years of fieldwork had taught her to keep calm when adrenaline spiked, but her mind was racing. Who was Edda Romley? Why had her father never mentioned this place, these people, this woman who looked like family? She searched the rest of the room. The filing cabinet held more document supply inventories, meeting minutes, philosophical statements about self-sufficiency and preparation for societal collapse. Standard survivalist material from the era. But in the back of the bottom drawer, she found something that made her breath catch. A stack of reel-to-reel audio tapes, each labeled with a date and a brief description. Community meeting, March 1964. Skills training, August 1965. Evening discussion, November 1966. She gathered what she could carry, the roster. A handful of documents and 3 of the tapes. She'd need to come back with better light, more time. But for now, she needed to get out of this buried space and back to her cabin, where she could think clearly. The climb back up felt longer than the descent. When she emerged, the afternoon sun was blinding after the darkness below. She stood for a moment, breathing hard, looking at the papers in her hand. 43 years she'd been alive. 43 years, and she'd never heard the name Edda Romley. Her father had never mentioned a collective or a bunker. He'd walked these mountains for decades and never once suggested there was anything here but trees and rock and wildlife. She looked back at the open hatch, then at the roster in her hand. The woman in the photograph stared up at her, frozen in 1962. Young and unaware of whatever had happened next. Edda folded the papers carefully and put them in her jacket pocket. She'd clear the rockslide tomorrow. Right now, she needed to get home, needed to examine what she'd found, needed to understand why the life she thought she knew suddenly felt like it had been built on silence and secrets she'd never thought to question. The walk back to her cabin took 15 minutes. She didn't hurry. Whatever waited in those papers and tapes had been waiting for decades. Another hour wouldn't matter. But with each step, she felt something changing inside her, the comfortable isolation she'd built so carefully starting to crack. Questions forming that she wasn't sure she wanted answered, but knew she could no longer ignore. She didn't sleep that night. The roster lay on her kitchen table, the photograph of Edda Romley staring up at the ceiling. Edda sat by the stove, the fire burning low, a mug of coffee growing cold in her hands. Outside, the temperature dropped toward freezing. Inside, questions circled like moths around a flame dot. Who builds a bunker and why? The answer seemed obvious: fear. Fear of war, of societal collapse, of some disaster real or imagined. The 60s had been full of that fear, nuclear anxiety thick enough to drive people into the ground. But why here? Why the Granite Vale Range, so remote that even now, most people couldn't find it on a map? And who was Edda Romley? She kept coming back to that question. The age was right. If Edda had been 19 in 1962, she'd have been born in 1943, 12 years before Edda. Old enough to be an older sister, young enough to be a cousin. The photograph suggested blood relation. The name confirmed it, but Vincent Romley had told her he had no siblings, no family beyond the wife who'd died and the daughter he'd raised alone. He'd been absolute about that. She remembered asking once, when she was maybe 10 or 11, if she had grandparents or aunts or uncles anywhere. He'd looked at her with those quiet, steady eyes and said, "Just us, Edda. That's all that's left." She'd believed him. Why wouldn't she? Children believe their parents until they learn otherwise. When the sun finally rose, she made a decision. She'd go back to the bunker and search it properly. Whatever this place was, whatever had happened here, the answers were down in that buried darkness. She gathered supplies, extra batteries for her flashlight, a headlamp, work gloves, a notebook and pen. She filled a thermos with coffee and packed dried fruit and jerky. If she was going to spend hours underground, she'd do it prepared. The walk to the site felt different now. She noticed things she'd passed 1,000 times: the angle of rock faces, the placement of certain trees, the way the land folded in on itself. Her father's old surveying maps were back at the cabin, marked with symbols she'd never paid much attention to. She wondered now if any of those marks indicated this place. If he'd known about it all along. The hatch stood open as she'd left it. She descended into the bunker with more confidence this time, her headlamp providing hands-free light. She started with the living quarters, examining everything more carefully. The bunks had names carved into the wooden frame's initials, mostly. She found IR on the lower left bunk. Edda Romley had slept here, probably for years. What had that been like? Sleeping underground, living by lamplight, cut off from the world above. The books on the shelf were a mix of practical guides and ideological manifestos. How to preserve food without refrigeration. The atlas shrugged was there, its spine cracked from repeated readings. A worn copy of Walden, several texts on sustainable living and preparedness. She opened each one, looking for marginalia, notes, anything personal. Most were clean, but one, a manual on wilderness first aid, had notes in the margins. A woman's handwriting, neat and precise. Vincent says, willow bark for fever. Yarrow for bleeding. Vincent. Her father's name. She sat down on the bunk, the book open in her lap. Her father had been here. He'd known about this place, known these people. And he'd helped them, shared his knowledge, taught them what he knew. The Vincent of her childhood had been remote, self-contained. But here was evidence of a different man, one who engaged with others, who taught and advised. She continued searching. The kitchen area held ancient canned goods, a hand-pumped water system still functional, and a small propane stove with empty tanks. The storage room revealed the real scale of the operation, enough supplies to sustain 23 people for at least a year, maybe longer. Rice in sealed barrels. Flour in metal containers. Salt, sugar, dried beans. Medical supplies that would have been valuable in 1965. Tools, hardware, seed packets in a waterproof box. Someone had invested serious money in this. Someone had planned for the long-term dot in what appeared to be an office space. She found the filing cabinet she'd seen the night before. She went through it drawer by drawer. The paperwork told a story of organization and control. Every aspect of life in the collective had been documented: work assignments, supply inventories, meeting minutes. The collective's leader was listed as Garrett Voss. His name appeared on nearly every document, his signature always bold and certain. The meeting minutes were revealing. Discussion of crop rotation. Debate over whether to accept new members. Arguments about whether children should be educated in traditional subjects or focus solely on survival skills. Mentions of tension, disagreements, ideological splits. By late 1966, the tone had shifted. References to maintaining security. Concerns about outside interference. Voss emphasizing the need for absolute commitment to the collective. The last meeting minute was dated January 14th, 1967. The final line read, GV reminds all members that departure from the collective constitutes breach of commitment. All understand consequences. No minutes after that date. Just silence. She found the reel-to-reel player in a corner, covered with a canvas tarp. It was heavy, built to last, the kind of equipment that cost serious money in the 60s. She checked it was battery-powered, designed for field use. The batteries were long dead, but she could replace those. She'd bring it back to the cabin, along with the tapes. Before leaving, she searched the personal quarters more thoroughly. Most had been cleared out, possessions removed. But Isla's bunk area held a footlocker, pushed back against the wall. She dragged it out, tried the latch. Locked. She looked around for something to pry it open, found a screwdriver in a toolkit, and worked the lock until it gave. Inside, clothing, decades old but preserved in the dry air. A wool sweater, dark green. Several cotton dresses, simple and practical. Underneath, wrapped in cloth, was a leather journal. Edda lifted it carefully, aware she was holding something intimate, something never meant to be found. She opened to the first page. The handwriting matched the notes in the first aid manual. January 1965. The second winter is harder than the first. We know now what to expect: the depth of cold, the weight of snow, how quickly darkness comes. But knowing doesn't make it easier. It makes it worse. She read several more entries. Isla's voice came through clearly thoughtful, observant, increasingly troubled. References to Garrett Voss growing more controlling. Mentions of members wanting to leave but being discouraged. And then, in an entry from March 1966, Vincent came by again today. He's worried about us, about what's happening here. He says the situation isn't sustainable, that Garrett's losing perspective. He asked me to leave, said he'd help me get out safely. But where would I go? What would I do? I'm 19 years old with no money, no skills beyond what I've learned here. And despite everything, this is the only family I've known since I left home. Edda read the words again. Vincent came by again. Her father hadn't just known about this place. He'd been checking on it, watching over someone who mattered to him. She flipped through the journal, scanning entries. The handwriting grew less steady as months passed. References to illness, to Garrett restricting supplies, to fear. The last entry was dated December 1966. I'm not well. Haven't been for weeks. Garrett won't let anyone go to town for medicine. Says we have everything we need here. That relying on outside help is weakness. Vincent doesn't know how bad it's gotten. When he came last week, I told him I was fine. I need to tell him the truth. I need to. The entry ended mid-sentence. Edda closed the journal carefully. Her hands were shaking now. This wasn't just a historical curiosity, some abandoned shelter she'd stumbled across. This was personal. This was family, and something had gone terribly wrong. She gathered everything, the journal, the roster, the tape player and tapes, documents from the filing cabinet. It took 3 trips to haul it all up to the surface. By the time she finished, the afternoon was fading. She loaded everything into her pack and one of her supply panniers. Before leaving, she stood at the hatch opening and looked down into the darkness. 23 people had lived here, worked here, invested their lives in the idea that this underground refuge would save them from whatever they feared above. 5 had never left. Edda Romley among them. What had happened in those final months? Where had everyone gone? And why had her father kept this secret for the rest of his life? The questions followed her home through the gathering dusk. When she reached her cabin, she spread everything on the table and the floor, creating a timeline from the documents. The collective had been founded in spring 1962 by Garrett Voss and 12 original members. By fall, 23 people lived in the bunker. They'd managed 4 winters underground before something went wrong. She found Isla's intake form in the papers, basic information about each member. Under emergency contact, Isla had written, Vincent Romley, brother, general delivery, Pinecrest, Montana. Brother. Edda stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the darkness. Her father had never mentioned having a sister. Never. Not once in 43 years. Isla had been his younger sister, and she joined a survivalist collective, and something had happened to her there. Something bad enough that the bunker had been abandoned. Bad enough that her father had sealed that entire chapter of his life away and never spoken of it again. She thought of the walking stick by the door, the only inheritance her father had left her. She thought of his long silences, his preference for wilderness over people, the way he taught her to be self-sufficient but never explained why it mattered so much. She'd thought she understood isolation, thought she'd chosen it freely. But maybe she'd inherited trauma and secrecy and the way of things never spoken. Maybe her father's silence had shaped her more than his words ever could. She sat back down at the table, pulled Isla's journal close, and started reading from the beginning. Whatever had happened here, whatever truth her father had kept hidden, she was going to find it. She owed that much to the young woman in the photograph, to her Aunt Isla, who'd written her last words in this journal and disappeared into history without anyone asking what became of her. The fire in the stove needed tending, but she didn't get up. She kept reading, following her aunt's voice through 2 years of hope and growing fear, toward an ending she already knew was coming but didn't yet understand. For 3 days, Edda tried to maintain her routine. She split wood, checked the weather, made her notes about wildlife patterns. But her mind kept returning to the documents spread across her table, to Isla's journal with its abrupt ending, to the questions that had no answers. On the 4th day, she gave up pretending. She drove back to the bunker with her truck's toolbox and retrieved the reel-to-reel player. The batteries were a special type, not something she'd have in her supplies. She'd need to go to town for those, and probably for more than that. She needed information, context, answers that wouldn't be found in a journal or on old tape recordings. The thought of going to Pinecrest made her chest tight. She hadn't been in nearly 6 weeks, had been planning to stretch it to 8. The town wasn't large, maybe 3,000 people, but after weeks in the mountains, even that felt overwhelming. Too many voices, too many eyes, too much stimulation, but she needed those batteries. She needed to hear what was on those tapes. And maybe, if she was honest with herself, she needed to talk to someone about what she'd found. Not everything. She wasn't ready to share Isla's story with strangers. But Ben Carlisle had been in Pinecrest his whole life. His father had been the county sheriff for 30 years. If anyone remembered a survivalist collective in the mountains, it would be Ben's family. She loaded her truck on a Thursday morning. The drive down was familiar switchbacks and washboard surfaces, creek crossings and boulder fields. The road hadn't been maintained in years. The county had given up on it after the last rancher in the area sold out. Now it was just her and the occasional hunter who got lost looking for elk. Pinecrest appeared where the valley widened out, where timber gave way to grassland. A main street 3 blocks long, buildings mostly from the 50s and 60s, a few older structures from mining days. Population had been declining for decades young. People left for college and never came back. The economy here based on nothing much anymore. Ben's store sat on the corner of Main and First. Carlisle General Supply, the sign said, same as it had for 60 years. She parked in front, took a breath, and went inside. The bell over the door rang. Ben looked up from behind the counter where he was doing inventory. Edda, didn't expect you for another couple weeks. Ran low on a few things, she said. It wasn't entirely a lie. Weather's holding nice. Should stay clear through October if the forecasts are right. He set down his clipboard. What do you need? She gave him a list: coffee, flour, the usual. Then added, you have any D-cell batteries? The heavy-duty kind? Sure. How many? A dozen. He raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Anything else? She hesitated. This was the moment to ask or let it go. Ben, you remember hearing anything about a survivalist group in the mountains back in the 60s? He studied her for a moment. That's a specific question. What brought it up? Just curious. I've been looking at some old maps, saw some marks I didn't recognize. Huh. He moved to the back room, returned with a box of batteries. My dad mentioned something once. A commune or collective, something like that. Said it was up in the Granite Vale area. Bunch of people thinking the world was about to end. This would have been, what, early 60s? They built some kind of shelter, lived underground for a few years. What happened to them? They left. Disbanded, I guess? Winter of 67, if I remember right. Dad said federal authorities came sniffing around, asking questions. But by the time they got up there, everyone was gone. Why would federal authorities care about a survivalist group? Ben shrugged. Dad thought maybe some of them were draft dodgers or radicals, people trying to get off the grid for political reasons. This was Vietnam era. Lots of folks had reasons to disappear. But I was just a kid then, didn't pay much attention to adult talk. She paid for her supplies, loaded them in the truck. Before leaving, she asked one more question. Your dad's still around? Died 8 years ago. Why? Just wondered if he'd have more details. He kept notes on everything: crime logs, incident reports, stuff the county never bothered filing properly. Mom has all his papers up in the attic. I keep meaning to go through them, donate them to the Historical Society or something. Never get around to it. Edda nodded. If you ever do, I'd be interested in reading them. Local history and all. Ben looked at her more carefully. You okay, Edda? You seem, I don't know, like something's bothering you. I'm fine. Just curious about some things. I found You're up there all alone most of the time. That gets to people eventually, you know? If you ever want to come down for coffee, talk about whatever. Doors open." The kindness in his voice made something twist in her chest. "I appreciate that." She left before he could say anything else. The library was 2 blocks away, housed in a brick building from 1923 that also served as the town historical society. She parked and sat in the truck for a few minutes, gathering herself. Libraries meant people, meant questions, meant engaging with a world she'd spent 10 years avoiding. But she'd come this far. She got out of the truck and went inside. The librarian at the desk was maybe 70, white hair and a neat bun, reading glasses on a chain. She looked up and smiled. "Help you find something? I'm interested in local history, specifically the 1960s. "Well, you're in luck. I'm Faye Drummond, been here 40 years, and I remember most of it. What specifically are you looking for?" Edda hesitated. There was a commune or collective in the mountains, Granite Vale area. "Do you have any records about it?" Faye's expression shifted: recognition, maybe curiosity. "The Voss Collective." "Yes, I remember. Caused quite a stir when they first showed up. Let me see what we have." She led Edda to a back room where filing cabinets held clippings and documents organized by decade. "We keep newspaper archives on microfiche, but I've got physical clippings too. Give me a minute." She returned with a folder. "Here." Wasn't much coverage, was pretty remote, and they kept to themselves mostly. But there was some reporting when they disbanded. Edda opened the folder. Newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. "Mysterious exodus from mountain commune." Read one headline from February. 1967. The article was brief. Members of the Granite Vale Collective had apparently left their mountain shelter during a severe winter storm. Authorities investigating found the bunker abandoned but intact, supplies and personal belongings left behind. No signs of violence or foul play. Several members were interviewed in nearby towns but refused to discuss why they'd left or where they were going. Another clipping listed names of those unaccounted for after the dissolution of the collective. Edda Romley was on that list. "Do you remember anything about these people?" Edda asked. "A little. Some of them came through town before they headed up into the mountains. Young folks mostly, idealistic types. Their leader was an older man, very intense. Voss, his name was Gerhard Voss. He'd give these speeches about self-reliance and the coming collapse of civilization. Some people thought he was brilliant. Others thought he was dangerous. What did you think?" "I thought he was a man who liked control. And I thought the people who followed him were looking for certainty in uncertain time. The 60s were hard that way. Vietnam, assassinations, civil unrest. Some people dealt with it by protesting. Others dealt with it by trying to disappear." "Did you ever hear what happened to Voss?" "No. He left town before the authorities could question him. Took whatever money the collective had and vanished. Some of the members who'd given him their life savings came looking for him, but he was long gone." Edda studied the newspaper photo, a grainy image of the bunker entrance, snow-covered, dark. The people who were unaccounted for. Did anyone ever find them? Not that I heard. Could be they just wanted privacy, didn't want to be tracked down. Or could be something worse happened. We never knew. Would there be official records? Police reports, investigation files? County sheriff would have handled it. But that was Tom Carlisle, Ben's father. And Tom didn't always file things properly. He kept his own notes separate from the official records. Ben mentioned that. Faye looked at her with open curiosity now. Why the interest? This was 50 years ago. Just came across some references in old maps. Thought it was interesting history. It's history, all right. The sad kind. People looking for safety and finding isolation instead. Never ends well, that kind of thing. Edda thanked her and made copies of the clippings. When she left the library, The afternoon sun was bright and warm, but she felt cold. She sat in her truck with the papers on the seat beside her, staring at Isla's name in print. Unaccounted for. Such a neutral phrase for what might have been death or disappearance or something worse. Her father had moved to the area in 1968, just months after the collective disbanded. He'd lived in Pinecrest for 2 years before moving deeper into the mountains. He'd worked as a surveyor, kept to himself, raised a daughter who knew nothing about any of this. The timeline was clear now. Vincent Romley had watched over his sister while she lived in that bunker. He'd warned her, tried to get her to leave. And when something went wrong, when the collective fell apart, he'd come looking for her. He'd stayed in the area for the rest of his life, never leaving, never moving on. Edda started the truck and drove back up into the mountains. She'd gotten what she came for: batteries and information. But she'd also gotten questions that felt heavier than any supply she carried. She thought about Ben's concern, his offer of coffee and conversation. For a moment, she'd wanted to accept, wanted to sit across from someone and talk about what she'd found, what it meant. But old habits held firm. She drove home alone, the way she'd come, leaving Pinecrest in her rearview mirror. The isolation she'd chosen suddenly felt less like freedom and more like inheritance, her father's legacy of silence, passed down without explanation. When she reached her cabin, the sun was setting. She unloaded her supplies, carried the batteries inside, and sat down with the reel-to-reel player. It was time to hear what voices from the past had to say. Time to stop avoiding the truth, whatever it was. The reel-to-reel player sat on her table, batteries installed, the first tape threaded through the mechanism. Edda had checked it twice. The drive wheels turned. The heads were clean. She pressed play and held her breath. Static first, then voices. The sound quality was surprisingly good. A man speaking, his tone measured and confident. Community meeting, March 17th, 1964. All members present. Garrett Voss presiding. A murmur of other voices, acknowledgement. Then Voss continued. We've been here nearly 2 years now. We've survived 2 winters, developed sustainable food sources, created a genuine alternative to the failing world above us. I'm proud of what we've accomplished together. Applause, scattered but genuine. Edda listened as Voss outlined plans for expanding their garden plots, improving water filtration, adding more storage capacity. He spoke well-articulate, persuasive. She could hear why people had followed him. Then another voice, younger, female. I'd like to propose we reconsider our educational approach. The children need more than survival skills. They need mathematics, literature, critical thinking. Edda stopped the tape, rewound it, played it again. That voice. She knew that voice or something very close to it. The cadence, the way certain words were emphasized. It was like hearing an echo of something familiar but distant. She let the tape continue. Voss responded to the woman Isla. It had to be Isla. Education is important, but we must prioritize what matters for our future here. The old world's knowledge won't serve us in the new one we're building. But we're not building something entirely new, Isla argued. We're preserving ourselves against possible collapse. That doesn't mean abandoning everything valuable from the culture we left behind. The culture we left behind is precisely what we're escaping, Voss said, his tone sharpening. Its values, its corruption, its inevitable decline. We're not preserving the old, we're creating the new. A pause, then Isla again, softer now. I understand. I just think we should be thoughtful about what we keep and what we discard. The discussion moved on to other topics: crop yields, supply needs, maintenance schedules. Edda fast-forwarded through parts, listening for Isla's voice. It appeared several times, always measured, always respectful, but clearly questioning. Here was a young woman not entirely convinced by the certainty around her. The second tape was from August 1965. The tone had shifted. Voss sounded more emphatic, more absolute in his statements. References to commitment and loyalty appeared frequently. When Isla spoke, suggesting they allow members to visit family in town, Voss shut down the idea immediately. "We are each other's family now," he said. "Outside connections weaken our resolve. They tempt us back toward the failing world we've rejected. Anyone who needs to maintain those connections doesn't truly belong here." Silence on the tape. Then another voice, male, agreeing with Voss. "We committed to this. We need to honor that commitment fully." Edda stopped the tape. She got up, paced to the window, looked out at the darkness. The mountains were black shapes against a star-filled sky. She'd lived up here for 10 years in isolation she'd chosen freely. But what Isla had experienced wasn't freedom. It was control disguised as community. She returned to the player and started the third tape. Community meeting, November 1966. The quality was slightly degraded, but the voices came through. This time, there was tension from the start. A woman speaking, not Isla. "Several of us have concerns about supply management. We're low on medical stores, and winter's coming. We need to make a trip to town." "We have everything we need," Voss responded. "We've always had everything we need. Your lack of faith in our preparedness is concerning. It's not about faith, Garrett. It's about reality. We're low on antibiotics, on pain medication. If someone gets seriously sick, then we treat them with natural remedies. With the knowledge we've accumulated here, we don't go running back to the system we rejected the moment things get difficult." Another voicemail. "My daughter has been coughing for 3 weeks. She needs medicine. She needs rest and proper care, both of which she can get here. Garrett, please. She's 5 years old. Let me take her to a doctor. The moment you leave, you're choosing their world over ours. Is that really what you want? To abandon everything we've built?" A long silence on the tape. Then the father's voice, defeated. "No, I'll stay." Edda felt sick. She stopped the tape, sat in the silence of her cabin. This was what her father had seen, what he'd worried about. Isla trapped in a system that called itself freedom, but functioned as imprisonment. And from the journal entries, Isla had been sick that final winter. Had needed medicine. Had been denied it. She thought about the newspaper clipping, the mysterious exodus in February 1967. Something had broken. Something had finally pushed the group past the point where Voss's control could hold. But by then, for some people, it was too late. She wanted to stop, to put the tapes away and pretend she'd never found them. But she'd come too far for that. She threaded in another tape, one she'd grabbed randomly from the collection. The label read Personal Recording, IR, December 1966. She pressed play. Isla's voice. "Alone now, no community meeting. I'm recording this because I need to say things I can't say out loud anymore. I'm 23 years old and I'm dying." That sounds dramatic, but it's true. I've been sick for 6 weeks. What started as a cold has settled in my lungs. I can't breathe properly. I'm weak all the time. And Garrett won't let anyone go for medicine. A pause. The sound of difficult breathing. Vincent came yesterday. I lied to him, told him I was fine. Just a lingering cough. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his eyes, but I convinced him I was getting better. I couldn't bear to see his worry. He's already given up so much watching over me from a distance, checking on this place, making sure we're all right. Another pause, longer. I need to tell him the truth. I need to ask him to get me out. But there's a complication I haven't told anyone about. I'm pregnant. 4 months. I've been hiding it, wearing loose clothes, staying in the background. If Garrett finds out, he'll never let me leave. He already talks about children as the collective's future, as belonging to all of us. My baby won't be mine. It will be his, the community's, raised according to his principles. Edda's hand went to her mouth. The tape continued. So, I have to choose. Do I tell Vincent and risk him trying to rescue me in a way that puts everyone in danger? Or do I stay quiet and hope I get strong enough to leave on my own? But every day I get weaker. Every day it becomes less likely I'll have the strength to walk out of here. The sound of crying, quiet and restrained. I don't want to die here. I don't want my baby born in this place. But I don't know what to do. I don't know how to... The recording ended abruptly. Eda sat frozen. The baby, Isla, had been pregnant. 4 months in December 1966, which meant the baby would have been born in, she did the math quickly, May 1967. But the collective had disbanded in February. What had happened in those months between December and February? Had Isla gotten sicker? Had the baby been born early? Had Vincent found out and finally taken action? She went back to Isla's journal, flipped to the final entries. December 1966. I'm not well. Haven't been for weeks. But no mention of pregnancy. Isla had kept that secret, even from her journal, knowing others might read it. Edda's mind raced through possibilities. If Isla had died in childbirth, if Vincent had been there, if he'd taken the baby, she stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. She walked to the dresser her father had made, pulled open the bottom drawer. Her birth certificate was there, along with other documents. She'd looked at it maybe twice in her life, never paying much attention to the details. She brought it to the table, held it under the lamp. Born May 12, 1967. Mother, Anne Romley. Father, Vincent Romley. Anne Romley. The woman she'd called mother until age 8, when aneurysm had taken her suddenly. A quiet woman, kind but distant, who'd never seemed quite comfortable with motherhood. Edda had assumed it was just her nature. Some people weren't naturally maternal. But what if Anne hadn't been her mother at all? What if Vincent had brought home an infant and asked his wife to help him raise it? What if everything she knew about her origins was a carefully constructed fiction, designed to protect her from a truth too complicated to explain? She looked at the date again. May 12, 1967. Exactly when Isla's baby would have been born if she'd been 4 months. Pregnant in December. The implications hit like a physical blow. She stood up, walked to the door, opened it to let cold air wash over her face. The night was silent, except for wind in the pines. Stars spread across the sky in familiar patterns. Everything looked the same as it always had, but nothing felt the same anymore. Isla Romley wasn't just her aunt. She was her mother. And Vincent wasn't just her father. He was her uncle, who'd raised her as his own daughter to honor a dying sister's wish. She sat on the porch steps, the cold seeping through her jeans. 43 years of identity suddenly in question. The isolation she'd chosen, the careful distance she kept from emotional connection, the way she'd built her life as a mirror of her father's, all of it rooted in secrets she'd never known existed. She thought about her father's silence, his long walks alone in the mountains, the way he'd look at her sometimes with an expression she couldn't read. Not disapproval, not disappointment. Something deeper. Grief, maybe. The weight of keeping a promise to a dying sister, of raising her child without ever being able to explain who she really was. The tears came then, finally. For Isla, who died alone in a bunker trying to protect her baby. For Vincent, who'd carried that weight his entire life. And for herself, 43 years old, sitting in the darkness, realizing her entire life had been shaped by a tragedy she'd never known about until now. She didn't return to the bunker for a week. Instead, she walked the mountains, retracing routes her father had taught her, seeing them with new understanding. Every trail, every landmark, every shelter he'd been teaching her survival. Yes, but also showing her the landscape that had defined the tragedy of his life. He'd walked these mountains for 40 years, searching for something he'd never find, keeping watch over a secret that had shaped everything he became. On the 8th day, She drove back down to Pinecrest. Ben was surprised to see her again so soon. Twice in 2 weeks. People are going to start thinking you're sociable. I need to ask you something, she said. Those papers your father kept, the unofficial records. Any chance I could look through them? This about the commune? She nodded. He studied her face, seemed to see something there that made him serious. Come by the house tomorrow morning. We'll go through them together. She spent the night in her truck parked behind the store, unable to face the drive back up and down again. When dawn came, she found a diner, forced herself to eat breakfast while other people talked around her. The normalcy of it felt foreign, people discussing weather and work and local news, as if the world were simple and comprehensible. Ben's house sat on the edge of town, a modest ranch style from the 50s. His wife had died 3 years ago, he'd mentioned once. He lived alone now, like Edda, but his isolation was circumstantial rather than chosen. He led her to the attic, where boxes lined the walls. Dad never threw anything away. Mom wanted to clear this out, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Figured someday someone might need this stuff for history. They spent 2 hours going through boxes. Most were routine traffic violations, property disputes, minor incidents. Then, Ben opened the box labeled 1966 to 1968 and pulled out a notebook. Here, these are his personal notes, not official reports. Edda took the notebook carefully. Tom Carlyle's handwriting was neat, methodical. She flipped through pages until she found an entry dated February 3, 1967. Called to investigate abandoned shelter in Granite Vale Range. Anonymous tip reported the commune had disbanded, members scattered. Found the bunker intact, supplies remaining, no signs of violence. Several members interviewed in town claim they left due to philosophical differences with leader Garrett Voss. When pressed, they reveal Voss had become increasingly controlling, restricting outside contact and access to medical care. One member, James Wheeler, states his daughter was seriously ill, and Voss refused to allow medical treatment. Wheeler took his daughter and left in late January. Others followed. Voss reportedly fled with collective's funds before authorities could question him. She continued reading. February 10, 1967. Federal agents arrived asking about the commune. Won't explain why feds are interested in a small survivalist group. Suspect some members may have been draft dodgers or persons of interest in other investigations. Agents conduct their own search of bunker. Remove several boxes of documents. Instruct me to seal investigation. Classify as closed. 5 members unaccounted for, including one Edda Romley, age 24. Agents say she likely left with other members who've chosen not to surface. Told to drop inquiry. A note in the margin added later. Vincent Romley inquired about Sister Isla, March 1967. Told him investigation closed. No leads. He didn't seem surprised. Stayed in area, took surveying work. Checking on him. Periodically, man seems broken. Staying close to something. Edda closed the notebook. Ben, did your father ever mention Vincent Romley specifically? A few times. Said he was a good man, carrying some heavy weight. Dad tried to befriend him, but Vincent kept his distance. After a few years, Dad stopped trying. Just let him be. Did he ever mention what happened to Edda Romley? Ben shook his head. No, but I remember him saying once that sometimes people disappear because they want to, and sometimes because they have to. He never explained what he meant. She thanked Ben and drove back to her cabin with the notebook. He'd let her borrow it, and a growing sense that she needed to search the bunker more thoroughly. The federal agents had removed documents, but they might have missed things. And she needed to know exactly what had happened in those final weeks. The next morning, she returned to the bunker with better equipment, work lights, a generator, proper tools. She'd been searching as a curious outsider before. Now she searched as family, looking for truth. She started in the living quarters, checking every corner, every crevice. Behind one of the bunks, she found something wedged between the frame and the wall, a small waterproof pouch. Inside, photographs. Isla and other members working in a garden plot somewhere above ground. Isla teaching children, pointing at a book. Isla standing next to a man, Vincent, younger than Edda had ever known him. His face less worn, but already serious. One photograph stopped her. Isla, clearly pregnant, sitting on a bunk. The photo was candid, unposed, taken by someone who didn't know they were being observed. Her hand rested on her belly, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. She'd been showing by then. Others must have known or suspected. But from the journal and recordings, Isla had tried to keep it secret as long as possible. Why? To avoid Voss's attention? To protect the baby from being claimed as collective property. Edda searched deeper. Under the floorboards in what had been Isla's space, she found a metal box. Locked like the footlocker, but smaller. She pried it open carefully. Inside, medical records, handwritten. Documentation of Isla's declining health through January and February 1967. Notes in Vincent's handwriting. He'd been monitoring her condition. Recording symptoms, trying to convince her to leave. An entry from February 14th. Isla's fever critical. Lungs severely compromised. Convinced her to let me bring doctor. Baby due within weeks. Can't wait any longer. Another entry, February 20th. Doctor confirms pneumonia, advanced. Risk to both mother and child. Arrange transport to hospital in Missoula. Isla refuses to leave until Voss gone. Fears he'll find her. Take baby. Waiting for a collective to disband. February 24th. Collective dissolved. Members scattered. Voss fled before I could reach him. Isla too weak to travel. Doctor says delivery must happen soon. Her body failing. Bringing medical supplies here. God help us. No more entries in the medical record. Just a final note on a separate piece of paper. Dated May 12, 1967. Isla died this morning, shortly after giving birth. Baby girl, healthy. Isla's last words, keep her safe. Tell her I loved her. Never tell her this place. Anne has agreed to help raise the child as our own. We'll name her Edda, after Isla's grandmother. No record of birth location. No connection to the collective. The baby deserves a life free of this tragedy. Edda sat on the cold concrete floor, the paper shaking in her hands. Her mother had died hours after giving birth to her. Had held her maybe once, long enough to ask for promises, to express love, to try to protect the daughter from inheriting the weight of this buried history. Vincent had honored that promise for 40 years. Never spoke of Isla, never mentioned the bunker, never explained why he'd raised another man's daughter as his own. No, wait. She looked back at the photographs. Vincent standing close to Isla, the way they looked at each other, not just siblings. Something more complicated. She found another photograph, tucked behind the others. Vincent and Isla, younger, before the collective. Written on the back, Vincent and Isla, summer 1960. Coeur d'Alene. She did the math. Isla was 17 in 1960. Vincent would have been, she didn't know his exact age. Mid-20s maybe. Old enough to be protective of a much younger sister. Old enough to feel responsible when she made choices he couldn't prevent. A new thought occurred to her. She looked through the documents again, searching for Isla's intake form. Found it. Under father's name, deceased. Mother's name, deceased. Next of kin, Vincent Romley, brother. Brother. Not guardian, not distant relative. Brother. And yet Vincent had visited frequently, had been intensely protective, had monitored her health with an attention that went beyond sibling concern. She thought about the baby herself, the fact that Isla had never named a father in any of the documents. The way Vincent had taken custody immediately, no questions of paternity or legal rights. A dark possibility formed. Had Isla joined the collective to escape something? Had Vincent's protectiveness been rooted in guilt? The timeline suggested Isla had left home at 17, joined the collective at 19. 2 years unaccounted for, but she was speculating now, filling gaps with assumptions. What she knew for certain was this: Isla had died giving birth to her. Vincent had raised her as his own, and both of them had carried secrets that shaped the course of her life without her knowledge. She gathered the documents, the photographs, the medical records. She'd been searching for history, but she'd found identity, her own origin story, hidden beneath 43 years of careful silence. As she climbed back up to daylight, she realized something had shifted. The questions hadn't disappeared, but they'd changed shape. She wasn't asking who these people were anymore. She was asking who she was in relation to them, how their choices had made her into the woman sitting in a mountain cabin, living in isolation that suddenly seemed less like choice and more like inheritance. She thought about Ben's concern, his offer of friendship, about Faye at the library, willing to share what she knew, about a world beyond her self-imposed exile that she'd been avoiding for 10 years, thinking it was freedom when it might have been fear. Isla had died in isolation, trapped by someone else's vision of safety. Vincent had lived in isolation, trapped by grief and promises. And Edda had built a life of isolation, thinking it was different, thinking she'd chosen it freely, but maybe she'd just been continuing a pattern, living out the unfinished story of people who'd come before her, carrying their isolation like an inheritance she'd never questioned until now. The bunker entrance looked different in the afternoon light. Not mysterious or frightening, just sad. A hole in the ground where people had tried to escape the world and found they'd only trapped themselves deeper in the very things they feared. She closed the hatch carefully, covered it with loose rock. She'd come back, eventually, to properly document everything for the historical society. But for now, she had enough. More than enough. She'd had a story that explained the shape of her life, even if it raised new questions about what came next. Back at her cabin, Edda spread her father's old surveying maps across the table next to the bunker documents. For years, she'd looked at these maps as simple records of terrain. Now she saw them as evidence of a lifetime spent keeping watch. The maps covered the entire Granite Vale Range, marked with Vincent's precise notations. Elevation changes, water sources, game trails. But there were other marks. She'd never paid attention to small symbols in the corners, coordinates written in faded pencil, dots that didn't correspond to any official survey points. She compared them to the annotated map she'd found in the bunker. The marks matched. Vincent had documented every location associated with the collective, the main bunker, 3 smaller supply caches, a garden site, a water collection system. And he'd updated these maps for decades, adding dates next to marks, indicating when he'd checked each location. The most recent date was from 2012, 6 months before he died. At 74 years old, he was still making the trek to these remote sites, still keeping watch over a past that wouldn't release him. She found a topographical map with a location she hadn't visited yet, marked with coordinates and a note: secondary cache, Northeast Ridge. The map showed it was about 3 miles from her cabin, accessible by a game trail that crossed a steep section of scree. She decided to go, not because she expected to find anything that would change what she already knew, but because walking her father's routes felt like a way of knowing him better, understanding why he'd spent 40 years in these mountains, why he'd never been able to leave. The hike took 2 hours. The trail was faint but visible if you knew what to look for: slight depressions in the ground, stones moved aside, branches broken at consistent intervals. Her father had maintained this path, kept it passable even as forests reclaimed it. The cache was hidden in a natural overhang, protected from weather. She found a wooden box, well constructed and sealed with pitch. Inside, more supplies, preserved food, first aid materials. And beneath those, a larger waterproof container. She opened it carefully. Photographs, dozens of them. The collective's full history in images. She saw people working, living, trying to build something that made sense to them. Children playing. Community meals. But also, Voss standing over meetings with an expression of absolute certainty. People looking tired, strained. A progression from hope to something darker. And photographs of Isla through those years. 17 to 24 in pictures. Growing from a serious teenager to a thoughtful young woman to someone who looked warm beyond her years. In the final photographs, she was thin, hollow-eyed, clearly unwell. But there was one photograph that made Edda's breath catch. Isla holding an infant just hours old, probably. The baby wrapped in a blanket. Isla's face showing pain and exhaustion, but also fierce love. Someone had captured this moment, preserved it. Vincent, she assumed, wanting Isla to be seen with her daughter, even if it was only once. Beneath the photographs, she found letters, dozens of them, written by Vincent to Isla over the years, but never sent. The earliest was dated 1963, a year after Isla joined the collective. Isla, I respect your choices, but I worry about you every day. Voss isn't what he seems. I've been asking around. He's done this before. Gather people who are vulnerable and idealistic, taken their money and their trust, then disappeared when things went wrong. Please, come home. I'll help you build whatever life you want, but not there. Not with him. Letters from 1964, 1965, each one more urgent. Isla, I saw you last week, and you didn't look well. You said everything was fine, but I know you. You're good at hiding when things hurt. Let me help. You don't have to stay there just because you've invested time in it. That's not a reason to keep making a mistake. A letter from 1966 after he'd found out about the pregnancy. Isla, I know you're scared. I know you think you have no options, but you do. I'll take care of you and the baby. I'll make sure you're both safe. We'll figure out the rest as we go. Just please, let me get you out of there while there's still time. The final letter was dated February 1967. Isla, the doctor says you're dying. I can't accept that. I won't. But you're refusing the hospital because you're afraid Voss will find you. He's gone, Isla. The collective fell apart. Everyone scattered. He took the money and ran. You can leave now, please. Let me take you to doctors who can help. Don't do this alone. Edda folded the letters carefully, her throat tight. Vincent had tried. He'd tried so hard to save his sister, and he'd failed. Not because he didn't care or didn't try hard enough, but because by the time Isla was willing to leave, it was too late. She looked through more of the container's contents. A small leather-bound book, Vincent's journal. Entries spanning from 1967 to 2012. She opened it randomly to an entry for 1985. Edda asked me today why I never married after Anne died. I told her some people are meant to be alone, that I was content with my life. She accepted that, the way children accept what adults tell them. But the truth is, I don't trust myself with closeness anymore. I failed Isla when she needed me most. I should have dragged her out of that bunker years earlier. Should have forced the issue instead of respecting her choices. And tried to tell me I did what I could, that I can't control another person's decisions. But Anne didn't understand. Isla wasn't just my sister. She was my responsibility. Our parents died when she was 12, and I raised her. Every choice she made after that was partly my fault because of what I taught her or failed to teach her, because of how I prepared her for the world or failed to prepare her. An entry from 1995. Edda got divorced today. She says she needs space, needs to be alone for a while. I recognize that impulse. I've lived it for 30 years. I should tell her it doesn't help, that isolation just preserves pain instead of healing it. But who am I to give advice? I've built my entire life around distance and silence. All I can do is hope she doesn't make the same mistakes I did. An entry from 2010. Edda moved to the mountains 3 years ago. She built a cabin not 5 miles from where Isla died. She doesn't know that, of course. Doesn't know this whole range is a memorial to someone she never knew existed. I watch her sometimes from a distance when I hike up to check on her. She's become what I became, someone who thinks solitude is safety. I did that to her. Taught her by example that people hurt you, that closeness leads to loss, that the only reliable protection is distance. I want to tell her about Isla, want to explain why I am the way I am, why maybe she doesn't have to be. But I promised Isla I'd never burden her daughter with this history. So I stay quiet, like I've always stayed quiet, and hope that somehow she finds a different path than the one I've walked. The final entry was from December 2012, 3 months before he died. I went to the bunker today. 55 years since Isla died there. The place is sealed up, overgrown, nearly invisible now. In another few decades, no one will know it existed. Maybe that's right. Maybe some stories should stay buried. But I think about Edda, 45 years old, and living like a hermit in these mountains. She's beautiful and smart and capable, and she's wasting her life the same way I wasted mine. She deserves to know where she comes from, why she is the way she is. She deserves the truth. But I'm 74 years old, and I've kept this secret for 45 years. I don't know how to break it now. I don't know if breaking it would help or hurt. So I'll keep silent, like I always have, and hope she somehow figures out on her own what I never learned, that surviving isn't the same as living. And isolation isn't the same as safety. Edda closed the journal, tears on her face. Her father had known exactly what he was doing to her, had seen the patterns repeating, and had felt too broken himself to intervene. He'd loved her enough to save her life, to raise her, to provide for her. But he'd been too damaged by grief and guilt to teach her how to live openly, how to risk connection, how to believe that closeness could be something other than inevitable loss. She sat in the cold afternoon, surrounded by her father's hidden archive, understanding finally that the isolation she'd chosen wasn't really choice at all. It was inheritance. Her father's grief lived out through her life, his inability to forgive himself for failing Isla, manifesting as her inability to trust connection. But understanding it didn't automatically fix it. She was still 43 years old, still living alone in mountains that held more ghosts than she'd ever imagined. The question wasn't whether she'd inherited patterns. She clearly had. The question was whether she could choose differently now that she understood where those patterns came from. She packed everything carefully. The photographs, the letters, her father's journal. She'd bring them home, add them to the archive she was building. Not to hide them, but to preserve them. Because this story, as painful as it was her story now. Her origin, her inheritance, the foundation of everything she'd built her life upon. As she hiked back, the sun dropping toward the western ridges, she thought about what she'd found. A mother who died to give her life. An uncle who'd raised her as a daughter, carrying guilt and grief he'd never expressed. A community that had tried to create safety and created a trap instead. And herself, the inheritor of all of it. Living in the same mountains, making the same choices, until she'd stumbled on a hatch that connected her to a past she'd never known existed. The isolation she'd chosen suddenly felt different. Not like freedom or peace. More like a cage she'd built so carefully she'd forgotten she was inside it. The question was whether she was ready to step outside, to risk the world her mother had died escaping, to trust connection despite everything her life had taught her about loss. She didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time in 10 years, she was asking the question. That had to count for something. When she reached her cabin, the sun had set. She built a fire, made coffee, spread the new documents alongside the old ones. The full story was taking shape now. Not complete, there were still gaps. Still questions, but substantial enough to understand the shape of what had happened. Tomorrow, she decided she'd drive back to Pinecrest. She'd talk to Ben properly, asked to hear his stories about his father's relationship with Vincent. She'd visit Faye again, see if she remembered anything else about the collective's dissolution. She'd start connecting dots, building a complete timeline. But more than that, she'd start practicing connection. Small steps. Coffee with Ben. Conversation with Faye. Letting people see her as something more than the isolated woman from the mountains. Not because she suddenly believed in easy intimacy, but because she was starting to understand the difference between chosen solitude and inherited isolation. Isla had wanted her daughter to be free of this story. Vincent had honored that wish by keeping everything silent. But freedom through ignorance wasn't really freedom. It was just another kind of trap. Real freedom meant knowing the truth and choosing how to live with it. Edda looked at the photograph of Isla, holding her infant daughter. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry you didn't get to see what kind of person I became. I'm sorry your brother carried so much pain trying to protect me from yours. And I'm sorry I built a life that honored isolation over connection. But I'm going to try to do better. I'm going to try to live differently. For you, for him, for myself." The fire crackled. Outside, the mountains held their secrets in darkness, and inside her cabin, Edda Romley sat surrounded by the evidence of her family's tragedy, finally understanding that the first step toward a different life was simply being willing to see clearly where the current one came from. She drove to Pinecrest the next morning with a decision already made. She'd spent 10 years avoiding vulnerability, keeping people at arm's length, telling herself it was preference when it was really protection. That ended now. Not all at once. She wasn't going to suddenly become someone who thrived in crowds or sought constant company, but she could start small. She could accept Ben's offer of coffee and conversation. She could share what she'd found, let someone else into the story. Ben was behind the counter when she arrived, helping an older customer with an order of fencing supplies. He saw her, smiled, held up a finger indicating he'd be a minute. She waited, noting how comfortable he seemed with the interaction. The easy rapport, the natural kindness. She'd always been able to do that in her old life, before the divorce, before the retreat. Maybe she could learn it again. When the customer left, Ben came around the counter, twice in 1 week. "This is becoming a habit. I was wondering if that coffee offer was still open." His expression shifted surprise, then something warmer. "Always. Close up in about 20 minutes. There's a decent diner down the street if you don't mind waiting. I'll wait." She spent the time looking at the store's offerings tools. Supplies, the accumulated inventory of decades serving a small community. When Ben locked the door, he led her 3 blocks to a place called Millie's, a diner that looked unchanged since 1975. They took a booth in the back. Coffee arrived without asking. Everyone got coffee at Millie's, apparently. Ben waited for her to start, patient in a way that made it easier. "I need to tell you something about the bunker," she said, "about why I've been asking questions." "All right." She laid it out, finding the hatch, Isla's name, the realization that this was family history she'd never known existed. She told him about the tapes, the journal, the photographs, about Vincent's letters and his lifetime of guilt. She didn't tell him about the pregnancy, about the timing of her own birth. That felt too raw, too personal to share yet. But Ben was smart enough to do the math. "Your father raised you alone after your mother died when you were 8. "Yes. And Isla was his sister who disappeared in 1967. "Yes." "Edda, that's the same year you were born." She met his eyes, said nothing. Let him see the confirmation there. He sat back, processed it. "Does anyone else know?" "Just you now. Why tell me?" "Because I'm tired of secrets. Because my father spent 40 years keeping silent and it ate him alive. Because I don't want to spend the next 40 years doing the same thing." He nodded slowly. What do you need? I need to know what your father knew. Everything he knew. If there's more in those papers, I need to see it. Come by tomorrow. We'll go through everything. They talked for 2 hours. Not just about the bunker, about other things too. His life in Pinecrest, his wife's death, what it was like running a business in a dying town. She found herself sharing more than she'd intended about the divorce, about choosing the mountains, about the difference between solitude and loneliness. When they finally left, evening was coming on. Thank you, she said. For what? For listening. For not making it weird. History's always complicated. Family history even more so. Nothing weird about wanting to understand where you come from. She drove back up the mountain feeling lighter. Small steps. That's how you changed patterns. One conversation at a time. One moment of vulnerability at a time. The next morning, she returned to Ben's house. They spread his father's papers across the kitchen table and worked through them systematically. Most were routine, but buried in a box labeled federal cases. They found something significant. A file on Garrett Voss. Tom Carlyle had done his own investigation after the federal agents shut down the official one. He'd contacted law enforcement in other states, built a profile. Voss had run similar operations before gathering vulnerable people, convincing them to pool their resources, then disappearing with the money when things fell apart. He'd been doing it since the early 50s. The Granite Vale Collective was his 3rd or 4th attempt. Dad thought he was a con man, Ben said. Someone who genuinely believed his own rhetoric but also wasn't above profiting from it. There were more documents, financial records Tom had somehow obtained. The collective members had contributed everything they owned when they joined. Property deeds, savings accounts, life insurance policies, all signed over to Voss for collective management. By 1967, the total value was substantial, maybe $500,000 in contemporary dollars. Dad tried to track Voss after he fled, Ben said. Got as far as California, then the trail went cold. Suspected he changed his name, started over somewhere else. Edda studied the documents. This context changed things. Isla hadn't just joined an idealistic community. She'd joined a controlled environment run by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate idealists. The medical neglect, the restrictions on leaving, the emphasis on loyalty. It was systematic exploitation disguised as philosophy. There's something else, Men said. He pulled out a manila envelope, aged and brittle. Dad marked this sensitive not for official filing. I found it years ago, but never opened it. Figured if he'd wanted it shared, he'd have filed it properly. He handed her the envelope. Inside, photographs, but not from the bunker. These were surveillance photos, grainy and taken from a distance. They showed Voss meeting with a man in what looked like a parking lot. The photos were dated March 1967, a month after the collective disbanded. There was a note in Tom Carlyle's handwriting. Voss spotted in Billings. Meeting with known associate. Appears to be dividing funds. Federal agents declined to pursue, stated case closed. Suspect federal interest was never about the collective itself, but about monitoring possible Soviet sympathizers. When that angle proved false, they lost interest. Voss free to continue pattern elsewhere. The next photograph made Edda's breath catch. It showed Voss and his associate near a car. In the background, barely visible, was another figure, a woman holding something, a bundle, possibly a child. The photograph was too distant to identify the woman clearly, but Tom had made a note. Unidentified female. Appears pregnant or carrying infant. Voss approached her briefly, was rebuffed. She left in separate vehicle heading east. Edda stared at the photo. The date was March 1967. Her birth date was May 12, 1967. If this was 2 months before she was born, what are you thinking? Ben asked. I'm thinking the timeline doesn't quite work. According to Vincent's notes, Isla died giving birth to me in the bunker on May 12th. But the collective disbanded in February. If she was in the bunker alone for 3 months, she stopped, a new possibility forming. Unless she wasn't in the bunker the whole time. Unless something else happened? She pulled out her father's medical notes, read them again carefully. Arranged transport to hospital in Missoula. Isla refuses to leave until Voss gone. That was February 20th. The collective disbanded February 24th. This photograph was March 3rd, in Billings, not Missoula. Then, where would someone go if they left the collective and needed to hide? Depends what they were hiding from. If it was Voss, they'd want distance and anonymity. Billings is big enough to disappear in. She laid out the documents, creating a new timeline. What if Isla didn't die in the bunker? What if Vincent got her out, took her somewhere safe? Somewhere away from these mountains, away from anywhere Voss would look. Then who died in the bunker? Maybe no one. Maybe Vincent's notes about her death were, she stopped. Or maybe I'm reading this wrong. Maybe I need to look at the original documents again. They spent another hour going through everything. Then Edda found it a detail she'd missed before. In the medical records, Vincent had written, baby girl, healthy, on May 12th. But there was no death certificate for Isla, no burial record. Nothing official documenting her death. Only Vincent's word that she'd died. Vincent, who'd kept secrets his entire life. Vincent, who'd been trying to protect his niece from a painful history. What if she didn't die? Edda said quietly, what if that's the biggest secret of all? Ben looked skeptical. Your father raised you. If Isla was alive, why wouldn't she? Because she was dying. Because she was too sick to care for an infant. Because she asked Vincent to take me and keep me safe. She remembered Isla's recording. I don't want my baby born in this place. Not, I won't survive the birth. Just, I don't want this for my child. But Vincent's notes say she died. Vincent's notes were never meant to be found. They were his private record, his way of processing grief. Or a colder possibility. His way of creating a paper trail if anyone ever asked questions. If anyone wondered where the baby came from. She thought about the photograph of Isla holding an infant. She'd assumed it was taken right after birth. Final moment captured before death. But what if it wasn't? What if Isla had survived long enough for Vincent to get her to a hospital? Long enough for her to hold her daughter and make a different kind of choice. I need to find out if Edda Romley died in 1967, she said. There would be records. Death certificates, hospital records, something. That's 50+ years ago. Records might not exist anymore, or might not be public. Then I'll find someone who remembers. Someone from the collective who survived, who knew what really happened. Ben pulled out his father's notes again, scanned through names. According to this, one former member was interviewed extensively, Pauline Tucker. Dad noted she was cooperative, but clearly traumatized by the experience. Last known address in Missoula. Think she's still alive? She'd be in her 80s now, if she is. But it's worth checking. Edda stood up, feeling something shift. Inside her, the story she thought she'd uncovered tragic but complete suddenly had gaps, possibilities she hadn't considered. Her mother might have survived childbirth, might have lived days, weeks, even years beyond that moment. Might have made choices Edda needed to understand before she could make sense of her own life. I'm going to Missoula, she said. When? Tomorrow. Today, if I can find an address. Ben looked at her seriously. Edda, you sure you want to do this? Sometimes the truth is harder than the version we tell ourselves. I spent 43 years living the version my father told me. I think I can handle the truth. But driving back to her cabin that night, she wondered if that was really true. What if Alla had survived? What if she'd lived for years, maybe still lived, and had never tried to contact her daughter? What if the abandonment wasn't death but choice? The questions followed her through the darkness, up the mountain road to her cabin, where all the documents lay waiting. She'd thought she was close to understanding. Now she realized she'd barely scratched the surface. The real story was still hidden, still waiting to be uncovered. And whatever that story was, it would change everything again. She spent the next 2 days preparing for Missoula. Not just gathering documents and organizing her questions, but preparing herself emotionally for whatever she might find. The possibility that Isla had survived and had never contacted her daughter carried implications that were hard to face, but she'd come too far to turn back now. She'd opened the hatch, descended into the darkness, and started following a trail that led beyond simple answers into complicated truth. Stopping now would mean living with questions for the rest of her life. Ben helped with research. He found a Pauline Tucker listed in Missoula, age 86, residing at Mountain View Care Facility. He called ahead, spoke with staff, confirmed she was capable of receiving visitors. He didn't mention what the visit was about, just said a family member of someone from her past wanted to talk. She said yes, he told Edda. Sounded eager, actually. Like she'd been waiting for someone to ask. The night before leaving, Edda went through all the documents one more time. She organized them chronologically, created a timeline with gaps marked clearly. The story it told was this: June 1962. Edda Romley, age 19, joins the Granite Vale Collective. 1962-1965. Isla becomes an integral member. Teaches children. Questions some of Voss's methods but stays committed. Early 1966. Isla becomes pregnant. Father unknown. Never identified. Late 1966. Isla's health declines. Vincent tries repeatedly to convince her to leave. January 1967. Collective. Members begin departing as conditions deteriorate. February 1967. Collective officially disbanded. Voss flees with funds. February-May 1967. Gap in records. Isla's location unknown. May 12, 1967. Vincent's note states Isla died giving birth. Baby girl, healthy, no death certificate found. March 1967. Tom Carlyle's photograph possibly shows Isla in Billings, 2 months before stated death date. The contradictions were obvious once laid out clearly. Either Vincent's timeline was wrong, or the surveillance photo wasn't Isla, or something more complicated had occurred. She packed the documents carefully, along with the photographs. The image of Isla holding her infant daughter would be crucial. If Pauline was who she claimed to be, she'd recognize Isla immediately. Ben offered to drive with her. 4 hours each way. You shouldn't do that alone. I've been doing things alone for 10 years. Yeah, and maybe that's part of the problem. She almost declined old instinct, keep people at distance. But she stopped herself. All right. Thank you. They left at dawn. The drive took them out of the mountains, through valleys transitioning to autumn gold, past small towns that barely qualified as towns anymore. They talked intermittently about his wife, about Edda's marriage, about the different ways people dealt with loss. The conversation felt natural, easy. She'd forgotten what that was like, talking to someone without guarding every word. Can I ask you something? Ben said as they approached Missoula. What will you do if Isla's alive? I don't know. What do you want to do? She thought about that. I want to ask her why. Why she never reached out, never tried to be part of my life. I want to understand if it was her choice, or if Vincent made that decision for her. I want to know if she thinks about me, wonders how I turned out. Those are hard questions. Everything about this has been hard. Mountain View Care Facility sat on the western edge of Missoula, a modern building with good views of the surrounding hills. They checked in at the front desk. A nurse led them to a common room where residents gathered for activities. Pauline Tucker sat in a wheelchair by the window, sunlight illuminating white hair and a face creased by decades, but still sharp-eyed. When she saw them approaching, she smiled. You must be Edda, she said. Good Lord, You look just like her." Edda sat down in the chair across from her, Ben standing nearby. "You knew Isla." "I knew her well. We were friends, maybe the only real friend she had in that place. I'd been waiting 50 years for someone to come asking about her. Why didn't you reach out? Try to contact someone?" "Isla made me promise not to. Made me swear I'd only tell her story if her daughter came looking. She said she didn't want you burdened with history unless you needed to know, unless it mattered to you." "It matters. It matters. Tell me everything." Pauline nodded, settled back in her chair. "I joined the collective in 1963, 23 years old, and convinced the world was ending. Garrett Voss seemed like he had answers, like he could protect us from whatever was coming. I believed him for 3 years before I started seeing through it." She described the slow evolution from hopeful community to controlled environment, Voss's increasing paranoia, the restrictions on contact with the outside world, the way he used people's idealism against them. Isla saw it earlier than most of us. She was smart, observant. But she was also trapped. She'd given everything to join, had nowhere else to go. And by early 1966, she was pregnant. Who was the father? She never told anyone. I suspected it was someone from outside the collective, someone she'd met during one of the rare supply runs. Voss would have been furious if he'd known. He saw us all as his family, his responsibility. A pregnancy with an outsider would have been seen as betrayal. What happened when she got sick? That was winter of 66 into 67. Started as a cold, settled in her lungs. Voss refused to let anyone get proper medical care. Said it showed weakness, dependence on the corrupt system we'd rejected. Some of us tried to help her with natural remedies, but it wasn't enough. She got worse and worse. And Vincent? Her brother. He'd been checking on us for years, worried about Isla. When he saw how sick she was, he tried everything to get her out. But she wouldn't leave. She was terrified Voss would find her, take her baby. She thought as long as she stayed in the bunker, she could hide the pregnancy, give birth, then figure out what to do. But the collective disbanded in February. Yes, finally several families had enough children were getting sick, supplies running low. They left in the middle of a blizzard, just walked away. I went with them. Voss panicked, took whatever money he could carry, and disappeared. By the time Vincent came back for Isla, most of us were gone. And Isla? Pauline's expression shifted, sadness mixed with something else. Vincent got her out. Took her to a hospital in Missoula. She was dying pneumonia, advanced malnutrition, fever. The doctor said she wouldn't survive more than a few days, but they could save the baby if they delivered early. And they did. Yes, emergency C-section. May 12, 1967. Beautiful baby girl. Isla held her for maybe an hour, named her Edda after her grandmother. Then she told Vincent to take the baby and raise her as his own. Sighed she didn't want her daughter knowing about the collective, about the mistakes she'd made, about growing up with a dying mother. Edda felt tears on her face but didn't wipe them away. She died? The doctors thought so. We all thought so. Vincent took the baby and left. I stayed with Isla. I was the only one there at the end. The hospital had her listed as critical. No family, no resources. They didn't expect her to make it through the night. But she did. Pauline met her eyes. She did. Took us all by surprise. The fever broke around midnight. The infection started responding to antibiotics. Within a week, she was conscious. Within a month, she was out of danger. Edda could barely breathe. Where is she? I don't know. After she recovered, she left Missoula. Told me she was going east, starting over. She said Vincent had made the right choice taking the baby. She had nothing to offer a child. No money, no home, no ability to be a mother after what she'd been through. She thought the baby would be better off, believing she was dead. She never reached out. Never tried to find out how I was? She asked me to check on you once, about 10 years after she left. I came to Pinecrest, asked around discreetly. Found out Vincent had raised you well, that you were healthy and happy. I reported back to Isla. That was the last time I heard from her. When was that? 1977, 1978. Long time ago. So she could still be alive. She'd be 82 now. It's possible. Edda sat back, processing. Her mother had survived, had chosen to stay away, believing her daughter was better off without her. All these years, Isla had been alive somewhere, carrying her own grief and guilt, making the same choice Vincent had made: protection through absence, love through distance. Do you have any way to contact her? No. She made sure of that. Said, clean breaks were the only kind that worked. Did she ever? Edda's voice broke. Did she ever say anything about me? About who she hoped I'd become? Pauline reached over, took her hand. She said she hoped you'd be strong but not hard, that you'd learn from her mistakes without knowing you were learning from them, that you'd build a life without the weight she carried. She said Vincent would teach you to survive, and she hoped you'd learn on your own how to live. Edda closed her eyes. Her mother's hope that she'd learn to live, not just survive. And she'd spent 10 years in the mountains doing exactly what her mother feared, isolating herself the way Isla had been isolated, confusing survival with living. Can I show you something? She pulled out the photograph of Isla holding the infant. Is this her? Pauline took the photograph with shaking hands. Yes, that's Isla, and that's you. She traced the image gently. Vincent must have taken this. He wanted her to have that moment, even if it was just once. She reached into a bag beside her wheelchair, pulled out a small photo album. I kept these. Isla gave them to me when she left, said they were too painful to carry. But I thought someday someone might want to see them. She handed the album to Edda, page after page of photographs from the collective. People working, living, trying to build something. And Isla throughout young, serious, gradually worn down by circumstances. But in every photo, even the difficult ones, there was strength, determination, the same expression Edda saw in her own mirror. There's one more thing, Pauline said. She reached into the bag again, pulled out an envelope yellowed with age. Isla wrote this before she left Missoula. She asked me to keep it. Said, if her daughter ever came looking for truth, I should give it to her. Edda took the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she recognized from the journal. For Edda, when she's ready. Do you want privacy to read it? Then ask quietly. No. Stay. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside, several pages covered in Isla's neat script. She began to read. My dear Edda, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way to the truth. I'm sorry for that. I hoped you'd never need to know. That Vincent would give you a life free from this history. But I also understand the need to know where you come from, to understand the choices that shaped you. I want you to know that giving you to Vincent was the hardest and most loving thing I ever did. I was 24 years old, dying from decisions I'd made and circumstances I couldn't control. I had nothing to offer you, no health, no ability to be the mother you deserved. Vincent could give you stability, safety, a chance at a normal life. Keeping you would have been selfish, would have tied you to a woman too broken to heal. I want you to know I didn't abandon you. I gave you the only thing I had left, a future free from my mistakes. I hope Vincent was kind to you. I hope he taught you to be strong and careful, without teaching you to be hard and isolated. Those are easy lessons to confuse. I want you to know that every day since I left that hospital, I've thought about you. Wondered who you became. Hoped you were happy. Prayed you never felt the loneliness I felt. Never made the mistakes I made. Never had to learn the hard way that isolation isn't safety. It's just another way of being trapped. Most of all, I want you to know you were wanted. You were loved. And the sacrifice of letting you go wasn't because you weren't enough. It was because I wasn't enough. You deserve better than what I could offer. Vincent could give you that better life. That's why I asked him to take you. Why I asked him never to tell you about me. Not because I didn't love you, but because I loved you enough to disappear. If you're reading this now, you're old enough to understand complicated love. The kind that looks like absence but is really protection. The kind that hurts but means safety for someone else. I hope you found people in your life who love you better than I could. I hope you've built connections, made a home, learned to trust. I hope you haven't inherited my loneliness, my mistakes, my fear. But if you have, if you've pulled away from people, built walls, convinced yourself that solitude is strength, then please hear this. You don't have to repeat my story. You can choose differently. You can risk connection, even when it's frightening. You can build a life that includes other people, that allows for vulnerability and trust and the possibility of being hurt. Because the alternative, isolation, safety through distance, isn't really living at all. I learned that too late to change my own path. But you're young. You have time. You have choices I never had. Use them well. Build a life I couldn't give you. Be the person I hoped you become, strong but not hard. Careful but not closed. Safe but not isolated. That's my hope for you. That's my prayer. That's why I'll let you go, so you could become someone free from the weight I carried. With all the love I couldn't show you. Isla. Edda folded the letter carefully, her hand shaking. Around her, the common room continued its quiet activities. Other families visiting, residents talking, life proceeding normally. But inside her, everything had shifted. The mother she'd never known had left her with words that spoke directly to the life she'd built. The choices she'd made, the isolation she'd embraced thinking it was freedom. Isla had seen it all coming. Had recognized the patterns that could be passed down even without knowledge of their origin. And she tried to warn her daughter across 50 years of silence. This isn't living. This is hiding. And hiding never saved anyone from pain, just from connection. Ben's hand was on her shoulder. Pauline watched her with concern and compassion. In this room with these people, Edda felt something crack open. The careful distance she'd maintained for a decade. The walls she'd built to protect herself. The isolation she'd called choice when it was really inheritance. Thank you, she managed to say to Pauline. Thank you for keeping this. For waiting. I promised her I would. And I kept my promises, even when they were hard. They stayed another hour. Pauline shared more stories, more photographs. The complete picture of Isla emerged, not just a victim of Garrett Voss's manipulation, but a woman who'd made choices, taken risks, loved deeply, and paid the price. A woman who'd been strong and careful, and in the end, wise enough to know when letting go was the greatest act of love she could offer. When they finally left, the afternoon sun was slanting low. They drove in silence for a while, processing. Then Ben said, "What now?" "Now I try to find her. She's been gone for 50 years, Edda. If she wanted to be found, I know, but I have to try. I have to let her know that I understand, that I'm not angry, that her sacrifice meant something." She paused. "And I have to tell her she was right. About everything. About the isolation, the patterns, the difference between surviving and living. I have to tell her I'm going to choose differently." Ben smiled. "Good. And I need to start that choosing now. Not after I find Isla, not after everything's resolved. Now. What does that look like?" "It looks like accepting help. It looks like having coffee in Pinecrest instead of disappearing back to my cabin for weeks at a time. It looks like being part of something instead of always being apart from everything." She looked at him. "It looks like saying yes when someone offers friendship instead of finding reasons to say no. I'm offering. I know. And I'm accepting." They drove back through the gathering darkness, but for the first time in years, Edda didn't feel the pull of her mountain isolation calling her home. She felt, instead, the possibility of a different kind of home, one built on connection instead of distance, on trust instead of caution, on the risk of being known instead of the safety of being hidden. Her mother had given her that gift, even from absence. The warning not to repeat the same mistakes, not to confuse isolation with strength. The hope that her daughter could choose differently, live freely, build a life worth living instead of just surviving. Edda looked out at the passing landscape, mountains and valleys. Light and shadow, the familiar terrain suddenly looking different. She'd spent 10 years up there, thinking she'd found peace. Now she understood she'd just been hiding, rehearsing her family's tragedy, continuing patterns she'd inherited without knowing their source. That ended now. Whatever came next, finding Isla or learning she'd died years ago, building friendships or facing the discomfort of vulnerability, she'd face it openly. No more hiding, no more isolation dressed up as strength. The mountains would still be there. Her cabin, her solitude when she needed it, but they wouldn't be her whole life anymore. They'd be part of a larger life, one that included people and connection and the risk of being hurt in exchange for the possibility of being known. That was what her mother had wanted for her. That was what she'd choose for herself. Starting now. Starting with the drive back to Pinecrest, where Ben's friendship waited. Where Faye at the library would want to hear the whole story. Where a community she'd been avoiding for a decade might welcome her back if she'd let them. Small steps. That's how you changed a life. One choice at a time. One moment of courage at a time. One decision to say yes instead of no. To stay instead of leave. To risk instead of hide. She could do that. She would do that. For Isla. For Vincent. For herself. The mountains rose ahead in the darkness. She'd return to them, but not the way she'd left. She'd return changed, ready to start building something new from the foundation of everything. She'd finally learned to understand. 3 months passed before Edda found another lead. 3 months of searching records, contacting libraries and hospitals and cities across the western states, following dead ends and vague possibilities. She hired a private investigator who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. The search became her project, but not her obsession. She made sure of that because in those 3 months, she also did something harder. She practiced connection. She drove to Pinecrest twice a week, had coffee with Ben, helped Faye at the library with a local history project. She accepted an invitation to a community potluck and went, despite the anxiety that made her hands shake. She taught a wilderness safety class at the community center and returned the next month to teach another one. Small steps, repeated until they became habit, until driving down from her cabin felt less like exposure and more like choice, until conversation felt less like performance and more like genuine exchange. The investigator called on a Tuesday morning in December. I think I found her. There's an Edda Romley, age 82, living in Ashland, Oregon. Works part-time at a bookstore, volunteers at a women's shelter. Lives alone, has for decades. It matches the timeline. And is hard-hammered. Are you certain it's her? As certain as I can be, without direct confirmation. The age is right. The background check shows no family connections, no marriage record, no children on file. She's been in Ashland since 1985. Before that, she was in Seattle. Before that, the trail gets murky, but it traces back to Montana in the right time frame. Does she know you've been looking? No, I've been discreet. What do you want to do? Edda thought about Pauline's warning that Isla had wanted clean breaks, had chosen distance deliberately. But she also thought about the letter, about her mother's hope that her daughter would choose differently, would build a life with connections instead of isolation. I'm going to Oregon, she said. I'm going to meet her. She told Ben that evening. They were having dinner at Millie's, something they did regularly now. He listened, then said, You want company for the drive? I should probably do this alone. Should, or want to. She smiled. Want to. But I need to face this on my own. Some things you have to do yourself. Fair enough, but I'll be here when you get back. Whatever you find, whatever happens, thank you. She left 2 days later, driving west through winter weather, following highways toward the coast. The drive took a full day. She stopped overnight in Boise, stayed in a motel where she barely slept, running through scenarios in her mind. What if Isla refused to see her? What if she was angry that her privacy had been violated? What if she looked at her daughter and felt nothing but regret? But also, what if she'd been waiting? What if 50 years of distance had been as painful for her as it had been protective? What if she wanted reunion as much as Edda did? Ashland was a small college town nestled in the mountains of southern Oregon. Arts-focused, progressive, the kind of place someone could disappear into and rebuild a quiet life. Edda found the bookstore easily, an independent shop on the main street, its windows full of carefully curated displays. She sat in her truck across the street for 20 minutes, gathering courage. Through the window, she could see someone moving inside, a woman with white hair pulled back in a practical bun, wearing jeans and a cardigan, helping a customer find something on the shelves. She looked ordinary. Not tragic, not haunted. Just a woman in her 80s doing her job, living her life. The disconnect between that image and Edda's mental picture of a dying young woman in a hospital was profound. Finally, she got out of the truck, crossed the street, opened the bookstore door, a bell chiming her arrival. The woman looked up and smiled, a practiced customer service smile. "Welcome. Let me know if you need help finding anything." Edda stood frozen, unable to speak. The woman's face was older, weathered by decades, but the features were unmistakable. The photographs hadn't lied. This was Edda Romley. The smile faded as Isla looked at her more carefully. Something shifted in her expression: confusion, then recognition, then something that might have been fear or hope or both at once. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh no. My name is Edda," she managed to say. "Edda Romley. I think you're my mother." The other customer glanced between them, sensing the tension. Isla seemed to notice, pulled herself together with visible effort. "Marcus, can you watch the shop for a few minutes?" A young man emerged from the back room. "Sure thing." Isla walked to the door, turned the sign to "back in 15 minutes. Then she looked at Edda. "There's a cafe next door. We should talk there." They walked in silence, sat at a corner table away from other patrons. Isla's hand shook as she removed her reading glasses, set them on the table. Up close, the resemblance was even clearer. The same bone structure, the same eyes, the same way of holding tension in the shoulders. "How did you find me?" Isla asked finally. "I found the bunker. Found your journal, the recordings, Vincent's notes. I talked to Pauline. She gave me your letter. Pauline's still alive?" "Yes, she kept her promise. Waited 50 years to tell someone your story." Isla closed her eyes briefly. "I asked Vincent never to tell you. I made him promise. He kept that promise. He died 5 years ago without ever saying a word. But I found the truth anyway. Found it because a rockslide exposed the hatch, and I couldn't stop myself from looking inside." "Vincent's dead?" "Yes, I'm sorry." Tears on Isla's face now, quick and surprising. "He was a good man. The best man I ever knew. He saved my life, saved yours. And I repaid him by disappearing, by making him carry all that weight alone. He understood. His journals, he understood why you left. Did he?" Isla looked at her directly now. Did he understand, or did he just accept it because that's what Vincent did? Accept things, carry weight, never complain? Both, maybe. They sat in silence for a moment. Then, Isla said, "You look like him, more than you look like me. You have his way of sitting, very still, very controlled. His way of watching before speaking. People used to say that. I'm glad. He would have been a good father. Better than I could have been as a mother. Why didn't you ever reach out? All these years, why didn't you try to find out how I was? If I was all right?" Isla's hands twisted together. Because I made a choice. A clean break, no looking back. I thought that was kindest. I thought if I kept checking in, kept monitoring from a distance, I'd just be torturing myself with what I couldn't have. So I walked away completely. Let Vincent raise you without interference. Let you have a life that wasn't shadowed by me. But you thought about me. Every single day. Every milestone you must have hit: first day of school, graduation, marriage, all of it. I wondered and hoped and prayed you were happy. But I didn't reach out because I'd made a promise to Vincent and to myself. Your life was yours, not mine. I'd given that up when I asked him to take you. Edda pulled out the photograph, the one of Isla holding her infant daughter. Set it on the table between them. Isla picked it up with shaking hands. Vincent took this. I'd forgotten. I thought I'd never see it again. He kept everything. The journals, the letters, the recordings. He never let go of any of it. And neither did you, did you? You've been carrying this your whole life, just like he did. Just like I started to. Isla looked at her. What do you mean, started to? I spent 10 years in the mountains living like a hermit. Convinced myself I was choosing solitude when I was really choosing isolation. Your letter, the one you left with Pauline, it described exactly what I'd become. Someone who thought distance was safety, who built walls so carefully I couldn't see they were walls at all. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. That's exactly what I hoped you wouldn't become. But I read your letter. I understood what you were trying to tell me. And I'm changing it. I'm choosing differently now. That's why I'm here. Not to punish you. Not to demand explanations. To tell you that I understand. That I'm not angry. That your sacrifice meant something. Don't, Isla whispered. Don't absolve me. I don't deserve it. I abandoned my daughter. That's the truth, no matter how I dress it up as sacrifice or protection. You gave me Vincent. You gave me a child and free from the weight you carried. You gave me a chance at a normal life. And you spent 10 years alone in the mountains. Doesn't sound very normal to me. I'm fixing that. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I'm learning to connect, to trust, to build something better than isolation. And part of that means meeting you. Not hiding from truth, not pretending history doesn't exist. Facing it directly and deciding what to do with it. Isla looked at her for a long moment. Then, very softly, what do you want from me? I want to know you. I want to hear your story in your own words. I want to understand who you are now, not just who you were 50 years ago. And I want, her voice caught, I want to know if you've ever wished things had been different. If you've ever wanted to know your daughter. Every day, Isla said immediately. Every single day of my life. But wanting and doing are different things. I made my choice. I thought it was permanent. It doesn't have to be. They sat in that cafe for 3 hours. Other customers came and went. The afternoon faded toward evening, and they talked. Isla told her story. The years after leaving Missoula, the different cities she'd lived in, the work she'd done, a life deliberately small, deliberately quiet, built around helping others in ways she couldn't help herself. I worked at women's shelters for 30 years, Isla said. Helped women escape situations they thought they couldn't leave. It was the only way I could make sense of what happened to me, what I'd survived. If I could help even one person avoid the mistakes I made, maybe it would mean something. It did mean something. You helped hundreds of people. But I couldn't help myself. Couldn't escape the guilt, the sense that I'd failed at the most important thing. I gave up my daughter. What kind of person does that? A person who was dying and wanted her child to live. A person who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. Isla looked out the window, tears tracking down her face. I was so young. 24 seems like nothing now. A child myself, really. But at the time, I thought I was making mature decisions, adult choices. I thought I understood what I was doing. You did the best you could. Did I? Or did I take the easy way out? Let Vincent handle everything while I disappeared into a life that didn't challenge me, didn't force me to face what I'd done? Edda reached across the table, took her mother's hand. The gesture felt strange. She'd never touched this woman before, never known she existed until months ago, but also natural, right in a way she couldn't explain. You survived. After everything, the collective, the sickness, losing your daughter, you survived and built a life. That's not easy. That's not taking the coward's way. That's courage, is it? Or is it just running in a different direction? Maybe both. Maybe that's okay. They sat in silence for a while, hands still touching across the table. Then Isla said, "Tell me about your life. Tell me everything." Vincent's notes, Pauline's stories, they're not the same as hearing it from you. So Edda told her about growing up with Vincent, about the quiet childhood in Montana, about learning wilderness skills and animal tracking, about her marriage and divorce, about choosing the mountains, about 10 years of isolation, and then about finding the bunker, about the journey of discovery that had led her here. "I'm a wildlife tracker," she said. "I spent 23 years with the Montana Wildlife Service. I'm good at reading patterns, understanding behavior, finding things that don't want to be found. I guess that explains how I found you." Isla smiled through tears. "Vincent taught you that. He was the best tracker I ever knew. Could read terrain like other people read books. He taught me a lot of things. Some of them good, some of them complicated, like isolation. But I'm unlearning that now. I have friends in Pinecrest. Ben Carlisle, his father was the sheriff who investigated the collective. And Faye, the librarian. I teach wilderness classes at the community center. Small things, but they matter. They do matter. Connection matters. I learned that too late to act on it, but I learned it. It's not too late." Isla looked at her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you don't have to keep running. You don't have to keep punishing yourself for choices you made when you were young and scared. You could." She hesitated. "You could come back. Not to the mountains, not to the places where everything went wrong, but to Montana, to Pinecrest. You could meet the people who've been part of this story. You could stop hiding. Edda, I'm 82 years old. I've been hiding for 55 years. I don't know how to do anything else. Neither did I, and I'm learning. You could learn too. You're asking a lot. I know. But I'm asking because I think it's important. For both of us. I'm trying to build a life that isn't based on isolation and secrets. Having my mother be part of that life, actually knowing her, not just knowing about her, that would matter." Isla closed her eyes. "I don't know if I can. The thought of going back, of seeing those places again, of meeting people who knew Vincent. You don't have to decide now. But think about it. At least think about it." "I will. I promise." They left the cafe as evening fell. Walked back to the bookstore where Marcus was closing up. Isla invited her to dinner, to stay overnight, to spend more time together. Edda accepted. They drove to Isla's small apartment, cooked a simple meal, talked late into the night about easier things, books, politics, the rhythms of daily life. When Edda finally went to sleep on Isla's couch, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not quite peace. Too much was still uncertain. Too many questions remained unanswered. But possibility. The sense that the story wasn't finished, that there were still choices to be made, paths to be followed. In the morning, over coffee, Isla said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About coming back to Montana. And I'm scared. Terrified, actually. But I'm curious. I want to see where you live. Want to meet the people you're learning to trust. Want to understand the life you're building. So you'll come? Not permanently, but for a visit. A few weeks, maybe. If that's all right with you." Edda felt tears building again. "More than all right. I need to arrange things here. get someone to cover my shifts at the bookstore, talk to the shelter about taking some time off. But in January, maybe? After the holidays? January is perfect. They spent 2 more days together. Walked through Ashland, visited the bookstore where Isla worked, talked to her neighbors and coworkers. Edda saw how her mother had built a life small but real, connected but bounded, meaningful despite its deliberate limitations. On the 3rd day, when Edda prepared to leave, they stood in the parking lot outside Isla's apartment. The goodbye felt heavy with significance. "Thank you," Isla said, "for finding me, for not being angry, for giving me a chance I don't deserve. Stop saying you don't deserve things. You deserve peace. You deserve connection. You deserve to know your daughter after all these years." They embraced, awkward at first, then genuine. Edda breathed in the scent of her mother's hair, felt the thinness of her shoulders, the reality of this person who'd been abstract for so long. "Drive safely," Isla said. "Call me when you get home." "I will." "And Edda? Thank you for being brave enough to look inside that bunker. Thank you for not letting the story stay buried. Thank you for surviving. For building a life even when it was hard. For being here when I finally found you." The drive back to Montana felt different from the drive out. Not lighter. Exactly, she was carrying more weight now, not less. But the weight felt purposeful. She wasn't carrying secrets and isolation anymore. She was carrying connection, possibility, the beginning of something that might grow into family if they both had courage enough to let it. She called Ben from the road, told him she'd found Isla, that it had gone better than expected. He listened, asked careful questions, offered support without being intrusive. The kind of friendship she was learning to value. "She's coming to visit in January," she said. "I want you to meet her." "I'd like that." "And Ben?" "Thank you. For being patient while I figured this out. For not giving up on me when I was still learning how to accept help. That's what friends do." I'm starting to understand that. When she finally pulled up to her cabin, the mountains dark around her, she felt the familiar pull of isolation, the comfort of being alone, answerable only to herself. But she recognized it now for what it was: habit, not preference. Safety, not strength. She'd return to town next week. Have coffee with Faye. Help with the library project. She'd keep teaching the wilderness classes. She'd maintain the connections she'd started to build. And in January, her mother would come. They'd navigate the awkwardness together, build something new from the fragments of a story that had stayed buried too long. It wouldn't be easy. Connection never was. But it was worth doing, worth trying, worth risking the possibility of pain for the possibility of something real. That was what her mother wanted to tell her in that letter. What Vincent had tried to model despite his own brokenness. What she was finally learning to understand. You survive alone, but you live with others. The difference matters. The choice matters, and she was choosing life. 3 months had passed since Isla's visit, and the mountains looked different to Edda now. Not physically, the same peaks still rose against the sky. The same pines whispered in the wind. The same trails wound through familiar terrain. But her relationship to them had changed. They were no longer a hiding place, just home, in the simplest sense of the word. Isla had stayed for 2 weeks in January, sleeping in the guest room Edda had finally furnished. They'd walked the mountains together, Edda pointing out the landmarks her father had taught her, Isla seeing them with eyes that carried different memories. They'd visited the bunker, now properly documented and registered with the Montana Historical Society as a historical site. Standing at the entrance, Isla had cried quietly while Edda held her hand. "I died here," Isla had said. "Not literally, but in every way that mattered. The girl I was, the person I thought I'd become, she died in that darkness. And Vincent saved what was left, gave it a chance to start over." They'd placed a memorial plaque at the entrance, bronze and simple. "In memory of Edda Romley, 1943 to 1967, and all who sought freedom but found themselves trapped. May their stories remind us that true survival requires both strength and connection. The dates were wrong, technically. Isla hadn't died in 1967, but that version of her had the young woman who'd entered the collective with hope and left it broken. The plaque honored that loss while acknowledging what came after. Isla had met Ben, had coffee with Faye, attended one of Edda's wilderness classes. She'd been quiet, reserved, clearly uncomfortable with attention, but she'd tried. That was what mattered. She'd stepped out of the isolation she'd maintained for 50 years and risked being seen. Before leaving, she'd asked if she could come back, maybe in the spring. She'd said tentatively, "For longer this time?" "As long as you want," Edda had told her. "This is your place too, if you want it to be." Now, in early April, Edda stood at her kitchen table, organizing documents for the Historical Society presentation she'd give next week. The bunker's story was becoming public history, not just her family's tragedy, but a cautionary tale about manipulation, isolation, and the difference between genuine community and coercive control. She'd found 12 other former collective members still living, scattered across the country. Most had declined to speak publicly, but 3 had contributed written statements. Their stories corroborated what she'd learned, that Voss had been a skilled manipulator who'd used people's idealism against them, that the collective had started as hope and ended in exploitation. One of the contributors, a woman named Hannah, who'd been 19 when she joined, had written, "I thought I was choosing freedom. I didn't realize until much later that real freedom means being able to leave, being able to question, being able to maintain connections with the world outside your immediate group." What we had wasn't freedom. It was another kind of prison, one we built ourselves under someone else's direction. Edda had read that statement to Isla during her visit. Her mother had nodded slowly. "That's exactly right. We thought we were escaping the world's problems. We were really just creating new ones, smaller and more controlled, but no less damaging." The Historical Society presentation would cover all of it: the collective's formation, its gradual transformation from idealistic community to controlling environment, its eventual dissolution, but also the human cost. Families separated, lives derailed, trust shattered, and the long aftermath, the way those experiences shape people decades later. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Ben, arriving for the weekly coffee, they'd made a ritual. She'd started inviting him up to the cabin instead of always meeting in town. Another small step toward integration rather than isolation. "Morning," he said, coming inside. "Faye sent these." He held up a box of pastries from the diner. "Said you need to eat more than jerky and oatmeal. Faye worries too much. Faye cares. There's a difference." They sat at the table, coffee and pastries between them, comfortable silence that didn't need filling. Eventually, Ben said, "You ready for next week's presentation?" "I think so." "Nervous, but ready. There's been a lot of interest." Faye says they've had calls from researchers, journalists, people who study cults and intentional communities. Your family's story is becoming more than just local history. I know. That's strange to think about something so personal becoming public. But important, right? That's why you're doing this. Yes, if it helps even one person recognize the warning signs, understand the difference between genuine community and manipulation, it's worth it. She thought about Isla's letter, about the hope her mother had expressed that she wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. This was part of that, using the story to help others, turning tragedy into teaching. "Isla's coming back next week," she said. "She wants to be there for the presentation. That's good. Brave of her. She's braver than she thinks." She spent 50 years believing she'd failed at everything that mattered. Now, she's starting to see that survival itself was a kind of success, that building any life after what she went through was an accomplishment. You helped her see that. Maybe, or maybe we helped each other. She gave me the warning I needed about isolation. I gave her the permission she needed to stop punishing herself. They finished their coffee, talked about easier things, weather, town news, Ben's plans to expand the store. When he left, Edda walked outside, looked at the mountains rising in every direction. Her father's walking stick leaned against the doorframe where it always had. She picked it up, felt the smooth wood he'd carved 40 years ago. She thought about Vincent, the man who'd raised her, who'd carried impossible weight with quiet, grace, who tried to protect her from history, only to have her uncover it anyway. I understand now, she said aloud, though he was 5 years gone. Why you did what you did. Why you kept silent. You were trying to give me freedom from the past. But real freedom isn't ignorance. It's understanding and choosing anyway. I choose connection. I choose vulnerability. I choose to risk being hurt for the possibility of being known. That's what Isla tried to tell me. That's what you should have known but couldn't quite believe yourself. The hawk circled overhead, riding thermals in the clear spring sky. She watched it for a moment, then turned back inside. She had work to do, the presentation to finalize, preparations for Isla's visit, her weekly wilderness class to plan. A life built not on isolation but on careful, deliberate connection. She'd return to town tomorrow, have dinner with Ben and Faye, discuss the presentation. She'd call Isla in the evening, hear about her day, share her own. Small rituals of relationship, practiced until they felt natural instead of frightening. The mountains would always be here, would always be part of who she was, but they wouldn't define her anymore. Wouldn't be her excuse for avoiding the messy, complicated work of being connected to other people. She thought about the bunker, sealed. Now but documented, its story preserved for anyone who needed to learn from it. A reminder that isolation wasn't safety, that walls built high enough became prisons, that survival without connection was just another way of being buried alive. At 62 years old, she was learning what her mother had hoped she'd know instinctively, that life meant risk, that love meant vulnerability, that the only way to truly survive was to be willing to be hurt in service of being real with other people. It was hard work. Some days it felt impossible, but it was also the most important work she'd ever done. She looked at the photograph on her mantel, Isla, holding her infant daughter, Vincent's shadow visible at the edge of the frame. 3 generations, all learning the same lessons at different costs. All finding their way, eventually, toward the same truth, that the human heart wasn't meant for isolation, that we survived alone but lived together, that the courage to connect was greater than the courage to hide. She'd spent 10 years in these mountains believing she'd found peace. Now she understood she'd just found another version of the bunker above ground instead of below. Chosen instead of coerced, but still a form of burial. Still a way of dying while technically remaining alive. Her mother had recognized the pattern and warned her. Her uncle had modeled a different way, despite his own brokenness. And she'd learned, finally, that the best way to honor their sacrifices was to live differently than they'd been able to openly, connected, willing to risk pain for the possibility of love. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin windows, illuminating dust motes in golden light. Outside, spring was arriving in the mountains, ice melting, creeks running high, the first green showing on the aspens. The world renewing itself, like it did every year, like she was learning to do herself. She picked up her phone, called Isla. When her mother answered, she said simply, "I'm looking forward to seeing you next week." "Me too. It feels like coming home, coming back there." Strange, isn't it? That place was the site of my worst experiences, but now it feels like possibility instead of trauma. Because you're not facing it alone anymore. Neither of us are. No, neither of us are. They talked for a few minutes more, then said goodbye. Edda set down the phone and stood in her cabin, her real home. The one she'd chosen and built, and was finally learning to share with others. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but honestly, openly, with courage. She was still learning to recognize as courage. The mountains held their secrets quietly, as they always had. But now Edda knew that some secrets needed exposing, some stories needed telling, some truths needed facing, no matter how painful. And she knew, finally, what her mother and uncle had learned too late, that survival wasn't the same as living, that isolation wasn't the same as safety, and that the hardest and most necessary choice was simply this: to risk connection despite everything that made connection frightening. She'd made that choice, would keep making it, every day, for as long as she had. That was enough. That was everything. Outside, the hawk still circled, free and alone, but returning always to the same territory, the same mountains, the same sky. Freedom and home weren't opposites, she realized. They were complements, each making the other possible. She understood that now. Understood it in her bones, in her choices, in the life she was building from the foundation of everything she'd finally learned to see clearly. At 62, she was finally learning to live. That was worth every hard step of the journey. That was worth everything.